Fashion is a very big part of steampunk, both in literature and the aesthetic itself. Steampunk fashion is all about doing it yourself while still creating something beautiful. Steampunk literature itself breaks apart genre classifications. Most publishers aren't really sure what to categorize steampunk literature as. Is it fantasy, science fiction, romance, mystery, horror, or is it something else entirely? Furthermore, the literature breaks the rules of the historical Victorian society, specifically regarding social and gender norms. The society's guidelines of what people of different genders do in the steampunk world are broken, along with how they act, dress, speak, and socialize. No rules are safe in the steampunk world, especially the rule of the gender binary. Steampunk lends itself well to the feminist perspective on the breakdown of gender through the body, because the genre naturally fights the historical Victorian era of constricting both female and male bodies to what was deemed appropriate. I go into historical Victorian fashion at length in my paper, but to sum it up quickly, men's fashion choices were often standardized and dull, and women were only seen as accessories, though society let them believe that they had the freedom of many fashion choices. In truth, they were really only a reflection of the family's status and the man's worth. Changes in women's fashion often showed a lack of originality, and instead of devising new styles for women's dress, there was a long series of revivals, borrowing from the past a medley of classical, Tudor, Stuart, and even medieval notions. While men's fashion was allowed to progress, women's fashion remained only to have sex appeal. None of the revivals were much concerned with the notion of utility. Having clothing suitable for outdoors activities was considered both very unbecoming and indelicate. Utility in dress, however, did become fashionable and produced the walking dress in 1863. This was an English invention by which the huge skirt could be hitched up over the crinoline and thus releasing the ankles, allowing the wearer to play croquet or other outdoor physical activities. The originality of such a dress that allowed for ankle movement and freedom was original in the fact that it did not attempt to be sex attractive, a sufficient reason, men thought, for regarding it as unladylike. In steampunk, there is unique clothing for each individual, personalized accessories, and bodies that aren't just there for sexual desires. Men and women have more of an option to wear what they want, or the clothes that work best with their job. Some female characters wear pants and shirts or other traditional male outfits, while other female characters wear dresses and corsets that make more sense in their altered world, such as bulletproof corsets. Male characters, likewise, have the same freedom. They are no longer bound by the standardized look. They can wear the height of fashion, their own fashion sense with bright colors and more typical feminine touches, or simply stride around London with only a cape that covers hardly anything at all. In my paper, I thoroughly delved into the differences between sex, sexuality, and gender, but for the purposes of this presentation, I don't have enough time to define each term and still do them justice. Instead, I will focus mainly on gender, as it is the key component to my literary analysis. Traditional views on gender places it in a very binary position, one or the other, male or female. Steampunk literature, however, explores the possibility of flexible genders through differing performances. Clothing and accessories worn with the character's clothes can lead a character to possess and or perform multiple genders. A character's gender is much more complex than this, though. Traditionally, as feminist Karen A. Martin says, gendered bodies create particular contexts for social relations as they signal, manage, and negotiate information about power and status. Because binary gender is linked to the patriarchal hierarchy, it creates a need to place every character into a category. But taken out of the patriarchal setting, gender is even harder to define. Famous feminist theorist Judith Butler writes specifically about gendered bodies and performing gender at length in her book Gender Trouble. She writes that performance produces the idea of gender on the surface of the body, and that the gendered body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various act which constitutes its reality. If gender was considered a performance, that would lead one to believe that there is an inner, truer gender. But how can there be a truer gender at a person's core if gender is a social construct? Thus, Butler concludes that if the inner truth of gender is a fabrication, and if true gender is a fantasy instituted and inscribed on the surface of the bodies, then it seems that genders can neither be true nor false, but are only produced as the truth affects as a discourse of primary and stable identity. Basically, there is no stable definition for gender, nor a way to say a person is inherently one gender over another. Genders are merely a form of categorizing people in a society, and also a way to keep heteronormativity within the society without people realizing it even exists. Steampunk goes right along with these notions of varying genders, allowing authors to write characters who don't fit into a heteronormative society. In a steampunk world, whether it is traditional Victorian era or industrial steampunk in a distant time in the future, society itself is altered. Gender is not as strict as a societal norm, and characters who identify as women have the most to gain from this freedom. Steampunk literature has taken present-day women's advancements and provided a society in which even larger steps forward towards gender equality can be found. The female body is at once a machine for the steampunk world that creates new forms of power and destroys old ones. It is also a sexed body, shown publicly in ways that Victorians would never have allowed a woman to be. Steampunk embraces a sliding scale of sexuality and gender, shattering the heterosexual axis of desire and the strict patriarchal society. Though the steampunk literary genre is wide and ever-expanding, only two popular novels will make up the bulk of my analysis: Gail Carriger's Soulless and Pip Valentine and T. Morris's Phoenix Rising. Carriger's Soulless is the first book of the Parasol Protectorate series, which follows the heroine Alexia Terabati. Carriger writes in the traditional steampunk category, using an altered history of the Victorian time period. In her world, vampires, werewolves, and ghosts are a part of London society. Such paranormal creatures are not the norm of steampunk, but they are tied into Carriger's society and steampunk evolution in her world. Alexia is also a preternatural, or someone who is born without a soul. Being preternatural allows Alexia to touch an immortal and, temporarily, render them mortal. The fashion in both novels are important, and are the key to studying how steampunk as a genre breaks society's gendered rules and how it allows for more freedom. Since I have defined gender as a social construct that is read by what is on the body, like clothing, I look at fashion and what characters have on their bodies. The fashion in Soulless is based heavily on historical clothing styles of the time period, but with greater individual freedoms. Alexia, being soulless, doesn't quite have an eye for fashion and usually wears something a few seasons out of style, but still dresses as a lady of the time should have. In the opening scene of the novel, Alexia wears a low-necked ball gown with full triple-layered underskirts, draped bustle, and ruffled taffeta top skirt. She also wears heeled velvet dancing shoes, which unbalance her in the opening struggle between her and the vampire who attacks her. Although Alexia wears the constraining Victorian clothing, Carriger uses it to show just how ridiculous it is, and how society uses it to restrict a woman's movements. Alexia is usually a very active spinster, and within the first 6 pages of the novel, kills her first vampire. Alexia manages to get around the annoying and cumbersome fashion, not allowing it to totally impede her actions. Steampunk allows Alexia to have more control over her body when she can use fashion accessories as weapons. Alexia always carries with her a parasol, even when it is terribly tasteless for her to do so. The parasol she carries in Soulless is a style entirely of her own devising, a black frilly confection with purple satin pansies sewn about, brass hardware, and buckshot in its silver tip. Not only does this parasol protect Alexia from the sun's rays, it protects her life. In the opening scene, Alexia uses the parasol to whack the vampire on top of his head, and then to give a vicious prod between his legs, before sliding her wooden stick into his chest a small amount. After he tries to attack her, again, Alexia grabs her parasol, swinging it in a wide arc. Purely by chance, the heavy tip struck the end of her wooden hair stick, driving it straight into the vampire's heart. Carriger combines the dignity of a Victorian lady with a strength both mental and physical that would have been unacceptable in a non-steampunk Victorian time. The fashion is even more flexible and open to individual interpretation by the characters in Valentine and Morris's Phoenix Rising. The novel is also a traditional steampunk in that it is a rewriting of Victorian time. But it is very different from Carriger's Victorian England. The two main characters, Wellington Books and Eliza D. Braun, are agents of the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences. Wellington is not a field agent, but rather the archivist. His new partner, Eliza, is a field agent who likes the thrill, excitement, and danger of the cases she investigates. Valentine and Morris use accessories on their heroine, Eliza, to challenge the Victorian image of a woman. Eliza is not the equivalent of Alexia. Gender is far more neutralized in Phoenix Rising and allows for characters to dress, behave, and act outside of Victorian social norms of male and female. Eliza is, quite simply, someone who kicks ass. She uses her body and clothing as weapons, in addition to more traditional weapons like pistols and sticks of dynamite. She's quite fond of a nice explosion. In the opening scene, when she rescues Wellington, she has several sticks of dynamite strapped around her thigh, and has pistols tucked into her corset throughout the entire novel. The body is a hiding place for weapons, and can be used as a weapon itself. Unlike Alexia's handmade parasol, Eliza's accessory weapon of choice is something that fits onto her body, a brass gauntlet. Once snug on her arm, the gauntlet moved seamlessly when she wriggled her fingers. The cogs ticked and whirred as she rotated her wrist and went from splay fingers to a tight fist. Then, when Eliza is investigating a bar and things get out of hand, we get to see how she can use the gauntlet as a body part and also as a weapon. A thug starts to threaten her, and that's when her gauntleted arm shot out, the brass fingers grabbing hold of the man's balls. When the sound of gears spinning and a tiny hiss of hydraulics, Eliza's armored fingers squeezed. The man could barely scream, let alone breathe. There are also switches on the gauntlet that she uses when the fight intensifies, bolas shooting out of the mechanism to incapacitate the thugs. So, steampunk is like a polite middle finger to society's rules for gender performances. In Soulless, gender performances are especially shown in one character, Lord Alkadama, a very old, very well-known vampire. Outrageous was a very good way of describing Lord Alkadama, with attire that is consistently absurd. Alexia describes Lord Alkadama as wearing 3-inch heels with ruby and gold buckles, yellow checked gaiters, gold satin breeches, an orange and lemon striped waistcoat, and an evening jacket of sunny pink brocade. His cravat was a frothy, flowing waterfall of orange, yellow, and pink Chinese silk, barely contained by a magnificently huge ruby pin. His ethereal face was powdered quite unnecessarily, for he was already completely pale, and sported round spots of pink blush on each cheek like a Punch and Judy puppet. He also had affected a gold monocle, although, like all vampires, he had perfect vision. Not all vampires dress like this, and in fact, it seems to be only Lord Alkadama and his crew of drones, and who are the humans who stay with vampires in hopes of turning into vampires themselves, who dress like this. Lord Alkadama even refers to them as drony poos, and gives each man their own cute nickname like Biffy and Tizzy. They share his fashion sense as well, dressing to the height of fashion and more, always wearing over-the-top, colorful items, but always remaining artistic and dignified. Although Victorian clothing for males had tendencies to be more feminine than masculine, Carragher has Alkadama and his drones as the only people in her universe that really dress like this, though others certainly try to mimic the fashion. The rest of the fashion for men is nowhere near as flamboyant, and more simple with suits and cloaks and hats, following the historical accurate standardization of men's fashion. Though at first Lord Alkadama's fashion was not accepted, he made it his own, and fashion in England actually started copying some of his styles and making them fashionable. Instead of these oddly dressed characters being ostracized from society and devalued as people, they actually gained status when pushing the social boundaries. Steampunk sets up the collapse of the gender binaries regarding dress. As the novels go on, the characters in Soulless no longer have to dress according to what is appropriate by society for their gender. In Phoenix Rising, Eliza embodies the tension of a woman dressing in man's clothing, and also the punk of steampunk in this novel. In Eliza's introduction to both the reader and to Wellington, Wellington describes Eliza as wearing the improper fashions of pinstripe breeches tucked neatly into boots that stopped just above the knee. More disturbingly than the fact that this lady was wearing trousers were the sticks of dynamite strapped around her thighs. The boots also had several sheaths for throwing knives. The bodice she was wearing was a black leather device, which not only served to lift the petite woman's bosom up, but also provided a secure surface for the baldric she wore across it. All this was accented with an impressive fur coat that flowed around her like a cape. Wellington may not see her as a proper lady when he first meets her, but Eliza herself doesn't seem to ever want to conform to such restrictive clothing choices as the other females. As a field agent for the ministry, her clothing is entirely appropriate for her lifestyle. In the first scene where she rescues Wellington from where he's locked up in New Zealand, Wellington notices her clothing choices as they escape the fortress. Eliza gives him a spare pair of tinted goggles, and they both wear them to be able to see through the blizzard outside. The climate had a sobering effect. Needles of cold tore through Wellington's suit, pants, and shoes. Agent Eliza Braun and her entirely unfeminine garb, however, made easy work of the snow. Even Wellington sees the advantages of her seemingly odd and unfeminine clothing. Through the book, he comes to learn that it is not just clothing or the performance of gender that makes a gender. Eliza's traditional unfeminine clothing does not take away her femininity. Instead of feeling ashamed of one's body, or hiding it under layers of clothes that covers the form, as women had to do in traditional Victorian history, steampunk allows women to feel pride in their bodies. Eliza knows just how much power she can wield by showing her body off in subtle ways. It is empowering for her, as it is for all the other characters in steampunk who feel confident in their bodies. Whether it is gay vampire drones dressed like dandies, or Eliza dressing in men's clothing, steampunk lets all genders dress the way they want to, when they want to. It allows for the freedom of power that comes from one's body, and the collapse of a strict binary social construction. Steampunk holds a lot more power than most people think upon first glance. When seriously studied, it allows for the gender binary and society's strict gender rules on gender performances to collapse, and everyone to act and dress as they so desire, without any negative backlash. So if you put your goggles on, or glasses, you can see for yourself the freedoms that steampunk brings to the modern world.